Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fifth and final day of the Australian Baha'i Community's National Conference on Social Cohesion and Inclusion. My name is Venus Kalesi, and it is my great pleasure to serve as your MC on behalf of the Australian Baha'i community. As we are broadcasting this morning from the grounds of the Baha'i House of Worship, located in Ingleside, New South Wales, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting from today, the Gurungai people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Well, what an incredible journey we have taken together, not only through the process of developing the Creating an Inclusive Narrative publication, which is the distillation of the thoughts, reflections, insights, and experiences offered during some 30 roundtables and podcast recordings, but also in its launch of our collective journey throughout this conference in speaking to our aspirations, examining lessons learned, as well as practical approaches on what it means to be a more socially cohesive Australia. To recap, we started our week alongside the Governor of New South Wales, Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, who helped to launch our publication and spoke about the role of leadership in strengthening social cohesion. We were also joined by Dr. Brian Adams, who spoke to how we can transcend the notion of tolerance and in more deeply appreciating the value we each bring in working towards a more harmonious society. Tuesday, this publication came to life with an interdisciplinary panel discussion alongside those who engaged in the media, government, civil society, and religion. This conversation was particularly unique as all the panelists had participated in the roundtables and offered their reflections on how the principles of consultation can be drawn on as a tool for greater cohesion. They also spoke to the significance of the different pathways to action as identified in the last section of the narrative publication. On Wednesday, we were joined together with Dr. Anne Ali, Member of Parliament, who presented on the impact of COVID-19 and our responses to the pandemic, which in many ways has been indicative of the strength of our social fabric in this nation. And yesterday, together with Reverend Tim Costello and Keishi Talik Ramesh, our minds were illumined by a thought-provoking discussion addressing the theme of social and economic inequalities and how we can move from a society focused on I to one with we at its core. Now, of course, a unique facet of this conference has been the breakout sessions. From Tuesday through to Thursday, we have had the opportunity to collectively reflect on the sessions, explore questions, build on each other's ideas, and reach new levels of understanding through the exchange of experience, much like the roundtables that were facilitated as part of the Creating an Inclusive Narrative project. This brings us to today's session, which will be a panel discussion focusing on social cohesion and the type of future that we want. To appreciate the range and breadth of experience this conversation will be drawing from, I'm going to attempt to offer a bridge introduction for each of our guests and invite you to visit our conference website to learn further about each of them. We would simply be here all day if I was to offer a detailed background for each of our respected panelists. I'm going to start with Uncle Ray Minikin, who is a descendant of the Kabi Kabi Nation and the Gurang Gurang Nation of Southeast Queensland. He is also a descendant of South Sea Islander people with connections to the people of Ambryn Island and Pentecost Island. Uncle Ray is a community pastor with St. John's Anglican Church in Glebe, where he is developing a unique and ambitious sacred tree ministry with St. John's members and community. He is also a director of Bungie Consultancies, which supports Aboriginal leadership and business. Uncle Ray is the founder and consultant on programs for the remaining men of Kinchalla Boys Home and the survivors of the Bomaderry Aboriginal Children's Home, the first designated home for Aboriginal babies of the Stolen Generations in New South Wales. Uncle Ray earned a BA in theology from Murdoch University. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Brian Adams, who serves on the Creating an Inclusive Narrative Advisory Board and is the director of the Centre for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue at Griffith University. Brian has a background in mediation, conflict management, and dialogue facilitation. His work spans over 20 years in settings across Africa, Europe, North America, and the Asia Pacific, bringing a compelling international perspective to his work. As a former Rotary Peace Fellow, Brian is primarily focused on promoting respect and understanding across cultural, religious, and organisational boundaries. And Jane Jeffs is an independent producer, director, and writer. Originally from the UK, Jane was head of programs at the UK's largest independent radio production company before moving to Sydney some 20 years ago. Since then, she has been responsible for a range of successful documentaries and factual programs through her own company, Firefly Productions, and with other production companies for broadcasters including the ABC, SBS, Channel 4, and Al Jazeera. Jane headed up the ABC's Religion and Ethics Unit for 4 years, was Communications and Impact Director for the G20 Interfaith Forum, helping to create the G20 Anti-Slavery Task Force in 2018, and in 2019 co-founded a project called War on Slavery. Now this year she's been focusing on recipes for Ramadan, which was launched during the COVID-19 pandemic and celebrates the diversity of Australian Muslim heritage, which has just been shortlisted for a New South Wales Premier's Multicultural Communications Award. Jane serves on a number of advisory boards, including the Creating an Inclusive Narrative project. She is a board director of Talamunde Youth Services, and of course, Talamunde is an Aboriginal word meaning refuge. Dr. Zenny Edwards is the Vice President and Director for Community Engagement of World Citizens Association of Australia. Zenny is an architectural historian, award-winning biographer, and cultural heritage advocate. She has previously served as the President of the National Trust of Australia for New South Wales, as the Chair of the New South Wales branch of UN Women Australia, and Vice President of the Institute for Global Peace and Sustainable Governance. Amongst her many current roles, Zenny is a member of the Management Committee of the Australian Council for Human Rights Education and is a member of the Creating an Inclusive Narrative Advisory Board. Of course, Hugh Remington, who I'm sure is a face familiar to many, is a National Affairs Editor with Network 10 and has reported from more than 40 countries spanning across South Africa, Uganda, Russia, Afghanistan, India, China, and he's just returned from reporting from the United States. Hugh has worked with the ABC as a foreign correspondent for CNN and the Nine Network as a political editor at Channel 10. He is a foundation board member of Soldier On and a board member of the John Mack Foundation. Hugh has received numerous awards, including the UN Association Media Award. In 2017, Hugh published his experiences as a journalist in his book titled Minefields, A Life in the News Game. Hugh also serves on the Inclusive Narratives Advisory Board. We also have joining us today my colleague Ida Walker, who is the Director of Public Discourse for the Australian Baha'i community. In this role, Ida serves as a representative of the Baha'i community, engaging in public discourse at the national level on matters which have a bearing on the betterment of Australian society by promoting, collaborating, and addressing issues of social importance, including social cohesion. Ida has played an integral role in the Creating an Inclusive Narrative journey, facilitating numerous roundtables, including the project's advisory board. And last but not least, Professor Stephen Pickard, who is the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture in Canberra. He's also the Director of the Strategic Research Centre in Public and Contextual Theology and Professor of Theology at Charles Sturt University in Canberra. He's an Assistant Bishop in the Diocese of Canberra and Goulburn and has served in a range of ministerial and academic appointments over 3.5 decades, both in Australia and the United Kingdom. Stephen served on the Creating an Inclusive Narrative Project Advisory Board. Well, what a wide range of experiences our conversation will not only draw from, but also benefit from today. Hugh, with that in mind, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Hello, Venus. Hopefully you can all see me. Thank you for that. Thank you to the panel and thank you to the Baha'i community for putting on this whole exercise. I am in that strange country that is known as hotel quarantine at the moment, having just come back from the United States. And I've had an opportunity, as we all have in recent weeks, to see a country which is like us in so many ways, that shares so many of our institutional values, our democratic values, where social cohesion is strained beyond breaking point. And we've seen it. I fear we will continue to see it there for some period of time. So this conference and this discussion is timely, and we have a living, working petri dish just across the Pacific Ocean for us to look at, to gaze upon when we think about what happens when it's not working. So welcome everybody, and thanks for taking the time today. And Pastor Ray Minicott, if I can start with you, given that we are on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land, wherever we are watching this, what does social cohesion and inclusion mean to you, do you think?
I come from the other side of 1967, so I know what social cohesion doesn't mean, because I've experienced that for nearly all my life, and I'm in my 70s now. So on the other side of 67, we were still under the notion of terra nullius. We didn't exist. We were nobody. And so no one lived here before 1960. Oh, well, actually 1992, when the Mabo decision was handed down, it was the first time that our land got discovered, that there were people here before. And then there was another decision by the High Court earlier this year that recognised that Aboriginal people have this other relationship to the land. And in 2017, we had the statement from the heart to give us more recognition in terms of a voice, to have a look at the past and tell the truth about who we are as a nation, and also then calling for a treaty. So if you read the statement from the heart, that's really where I feel that we're at the moment. And then that we did start a process of reconciliation back in the early 1990s with after the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody. And one of the recommendations was to start a reconciliatory process in this country that could possibly, hopefully, reduce the high incarceration rates, as well as the deaths in custody of our people, as well as the forcible removal of our children. But it hasn't got us the kind of results that we want as Aboriginal people. So we're still on this journey. And we're the ones always trying to figure out how we can get people to listen and take upon themselves this particular very challenging issue of reconciliatory processes, as well as social inclusion and being included in decision making and included in the ways in which we can be seen and heard. We know how to look after our country. We've done it for 60,000 years. We know how to look after ourselves, and I'm sure we have the incredible wisdom and capacity to look after everybody in our country if we're given the opportunity. So that's what social inclusion means, is to revisit the statement from the heart, look at what it means to have a voice in Parliament, look what it means to have an agreement where we can live in this country and recognise the sovereignty that was here before 1770 and 1778. And then also look at the history that has happened over the last 200 years and try to make things right. The truth will set us free. So they're the key issues for me that we need to examine as a nation in terms of social inclusion and diversity.
And so, Uncle Ray, as we hear from other speakers, as we shortly will, would it be the case that all conversations of social inclusion are really essentially underpowered? They simply are not meeting the mark unless they are completely open to the Aboriginal experience to the degree that people who are non-Aboriginal can be open to that experience, and completely putting Aboriginality and the rights and concerns of the First Nations people at the front of this queue?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the Reconciliation Council has identified 5 key areas that they want to see this process take place. And one is that historical acceptance of who we are and our sovereignty. The relationships that we have with other races of people who are now in our country, which we still are working on. And we do need to see that, equity and equality coming through in terms of the discussions as well as the actions that we practice. We want to see institutional integrity, and we do. We yearn for a unity in this country amongst all the people, all the new nations who've come into our country. We want to relate to them and they with us. But somehow there's these barriers there that we need to address all and overcome.
On that note, Ida Walker from the Baha'i community, your bugbear, as you described it to me, is unity in diversity. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I guess maybe I just wanted to offer for consideration in our discussion, but also for those who are listening, a couple of concepts, maybe just to build on what Uncle Ray was saying. And one concept being around the oneness of humanity, that we're all one human family, irrespective of the nations in which we've come from. We all share this same earth. And one of the implications of this principle is that we would never allow one family member to flourish at the expense and suffering of another member of that family. And this other concept that you raised, Hugh, about unity and diversity, where we can really draw on the diverse expressions of culture, ideas, and experience and channel them in a way that's a unified way towards the well-being and flourishing of everyone, where the highest and noblest aspirations of society can be realized. So we do need to be drawing on the diverse perspectives that exist, of those which may even seemingly have different ones to my own, and need to be actively sought out and listened to in order to forge the kind of society that we hope we can become. And I think what Uncle Ray was saying is this aspect of inclusiveness is not just that people are not excluded, but really seriously considered about their historical experience with injustice, or the types of knowledge and wisdom that can actually shape a new kind of society that does live harmoniously, that does work towards that common goal of human flourishing and can release the potential of every individual that lives here, so that we have a healthy society spiritually, economically, as well as socially. So that's one point I want to bring to this discussion today.
Brian Adams, if I can bring you in, what makes an inclusive society, so far as you're concerned? You're an expert in conflict management. How do we move in the opposite direction to conflict to make sure that we all have an Australian identity that allows room for everyone else?
Before I jump into that, I have a burning question for you, Hugh, because
Hit me
tied
with
to
it.
your introduction there, you're in hotel quarantine. Is that anything like Hotel California, where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave? Is that?
Well, you can't even check out. So, in fact, if I just keep this going on all day long, it's because you're the only faces I've seen in 10 days. I won't allow myself to let you go.
you know you're aching for company when you want to see my face all day long. So.
Well, you have the floor, Brian.
Well, I think when I look at social cohesion, or when I speak about social cohesion, it's not a goal, right? We don't work together for a while until we achieve social cohesion, and then, hey, this is great. We have the best situation in the world. It's actually a standard by which we continue to measure our society as we grow, because Australia, like any country, is dynamic. We're going to have other challenges in the future that will reshape our institutions, our relationships with each other, even the ways we think about our place in the world. And so social cohesion is this standard. Are we maintaining or strengthening social cohesion as we respond to the vicissitudes and opportunities that life gives? And I think one of the ways to help measure that standard is the concepts of valid and valued. And what I mean by that is, how well are we, first of all, establishing and articulating the valid place that our diverse society, many in our diverse society have, but at the same time, are we working towards valuing their contribution as well, that their distinctiveness is something that we can all draw upon and to make us a more cohesive society. So those are kind of the broad brushstrokes of the way I approach social cohesion.
I really want to drill down a bit on that notion of valued rather than merely valid, because this is something which strikes me. A phrase I don't like is a tolerant society. A tolerant society seems to be shooting far too low, so far as I'm concerned. I don't want to merely tolerate those around me. I understand that it has a history and a meaning in terms of liberal, political theory and so on. What I'd like to see is a celebratory society in which we really do celebrate diversity, celebrate what everyone can bring to us, and live that. Is that what you're getting at with that concept you have of valued rather than valid?
Yeah, somewhat. I don't speak a lot about a celebratory society, and one of the challenges with because I think in the idea of multiculturalism, we replace engagement and understanding with celebration, and it becomes almost a surface, political event almost to make things look good, rather than understanding and fully respecting another's difference or another's distinctiveness. But so what? Oh goodness, I lost my thought now.
No, I do get that. The celebratory was not the, if you like, the public display of it, the political display of it, so much as what exactly exists in our hearts. That was the idea that feels for me,
Yeah.
so that there's a curiosity about different people's experiences, but a total embrace of them as people. That's the goal, I suppose. Maybe too idealistic.
One of the dangers when you do talk about valuing another or their contribution is it so often is either in relation to you, right? Well, you bring more value than this other person, so therefore I value you more. Or perhaps even more dastardly than that is we seem to shrink value to an economic measurement or an economic evaluation. And while different cultures, different religions have, of course, economic impact and contributions to Australia, it's so much more than that. And that shouldn't be the main or principal measure of another's contribution.
I wonder if we can go to some of the questions of what might be the obstacles. We've got the media, we've got political leadership, we've got education. Zeni, I don't know if you're still with us, but I know that for you, education is of enormous value in terms of making the country the one that we want it to be. Can you hear us, Zeni?
Yes, and I'm sorry, there's something going on with it might be a cyber attack or something like that, preventing us from speaking out, maybe. Education is, for me, I think the youth should hold us into account because we're responsible for their future. And I think education and youth is a vast resource, and they should be empowered to speak their mind and not be restricted to sort of just be the academic thing, but just be more broad minded and look into the world problems, which they do. They're very concerned about the climate and the environment and lack of the mental health and the social isolation that they are experiencing, and we really need to support that, not just the teaching and the education, but the psychological support, and just empower them to speak their own minds and come out of their shell and not be afraid to say that whatever they think and whatever they say is equally important. No one is better than the other.
What if the things which are coming out of their mouths are the very opposite of socially inclusive? We've seen in a welter of free speech in the United States that a lot of the voices that are being privileged at the moment are highly toxic to the notion of social inclusion. Where do we fit in voices for dissent against the things that we hold most precious? In other words, I guess to borrow from the former Attorney General George Brandis, is it okay to be a bigot? And what do we do when those voices are expressed?
This is where I blame the social media in that sort of regard. Peer pressure. Our leaders are not really the models of probity and integrity. So they're taking things from what they see around them, from their environment, from their social circles, and from their sometimes families and their communities and the government. What can we do to prevent that? We just have to keep trying to reach out to them and teach them by example, by action, that better ways of behaving is really the way to go, rather than going with the peer pressure and all these misinformation and disinformation.
I think it's time to bring in Professor Stephen Pickard. You've been waiting there at the end of the queue, but your place in that queue does not reflect the quality and the depth of your thought on these subjects over such a long period of time. Listening to what you're hearing there, Stephen, and I know you've heard this before in other forums. Where do you think we're heading? How do we get shared values, and how much does a concept of a shared history, what we're going to unify us so that we have shared values that ultimately are things that we can all agree on?
Thanks, Hugh. They're quite simple questions, aren't they? Very complex answers, I'm afraid. I've been thinking, as I've been hearing my fellow panelists speaking, not so much what is social cohesion, but where does it come from? Where do we get that sense of being one? And I want to suggest to you that right now we're in massive times of social transition, uncertainty. The issues about social cohesion are urgent, but they're also elusive. And for my money, I would say we're caught between kind of a government, state, nation state, and individuals, the rampant individualism. But what we could do much more deliberately and intentionally is to foster, nurture, encourage the development of civil society, community groups, NGOs, that are what I think are the excluded middle between the state, which seems to determine so much of our life, and legislation and law, and the free market of individuals to say whatever they think and to do whatever they think, which are captive to social media, as Annie was saying. But in between these two, there is this wonderful, rich source of our social life together, which has to do with civil society and community groups, NGOs, and a whole range of other institutional embodiments of where values do come from. But they're excluded for the most part in a lot of the social political rhetoric that we have today. But if we want to know where the grassroots really take place for the emergence of new values, we've got to go back to the fundamental communitarian ethos of a lot of social groups that are the glue when things are in transition and things are in conflict. We've got to recover the sense of the importance of civil society.
Do you have confidence that the civil society that exists in Australia is one which is interested in being in the glue that you describe? We see in the United States a lot of it falling in fact, racing in opposite directions. Where are we in that here at the moment? There are dissenting voices. There are a range of voices in contest with each other.
Yeah.
Are we glue or are we ammonium nitrate?
Yeah, that's very apposite analogy, Hugh. I think we have the potential to be the glue. Those the thing is, we should expect a contestation about values. We should expect that in a pluralistic, diverse society. But we also should aspire to having the conversations within the different civil society groups and community groups to learn to listen to each other, so that we discover what are some of the common threads that do hold us together under the glue. But when we don't engage in listening with one another and recognizing that we'll have a whole variety of different ways of seeing things and things we value, when we exclude that listening dialogue, then we're really in trouble. Like in any family context, where dysfunctional families can't listen to each other, dysfunctional societies cease listening. They don't have the capacity, they're not well enough. But I actually think Australia has got a track record of being able to find a way to do this kind of thing much better.
All right, interesting. I will invite you, if you're participating, you can put questions to us down the bottom of the screen. I think it's in the Q&A. If you type in a question anyway, we can do it, I think, and they will come to us in the next few minutes. But conversations, Jane Jeffs, are really the job of the media to make them possible. What is the role of the media in making us better, not worse?
It's such an interesting question. I think the media is having quite a tough job at the moment to make us better, not worse. And I know we want to look to the future, but it's just as a comparison to the past. As I was graduating university and starting to work in I suppose, the middle 80s, the media, like all industry, like politics, was fragmenting and being deregulated. And the idea at the time was that more media would give the consumer more choice. And of course, as so often happens with these things, it seems a good idea at the time. But nobody, I think, anticipated that fragmentation would actually lead to, the words that we're now very familiar with, like echo chambers and bubbles, and specialist interest groups who don't actually talk across boundaries, who just reinforce their own views. And I would like to think that the media has a responsibility to be able to engage different views, not simply by giving those different views a platform at different times, but by having the sorts of discussion that doesn't get had as much on radio and television as it used to have, and hasn't been replaced, I don't think, anywhere else. There are lots of podcasts, some with guests, some without, but they don't necessarily draw on, for example, as Stephen was talking about, civil society. And I think some of the programming or content, as we now call it, the conversations, the public conversations that used to be had, were had across a large group of society. There was appointment television, there was appointment radio. In the UK, which is where I come from originally, people knew the sort of things that were being discussed on Woman's Hour because a large number of people listened to it. And I think now, many programs have small audiences, and inevitably you don't get that sort of crossover of ideas that leads to challenging ideas and new ideas.
I was struck, Jane, in the United States. I went down to the Virginia woods and met a man who was collecting guns, and he had 20 years worth of ammunition stocked up in his property in the woods. He was a very friendly guy. He cooked us up some ribs for lunch. And he was ready, if Trump was to lose the election, to go with his fellows armed to his defense, because he was completely convinced Trump could only lose the election if it was stolen from him by liberal elites. And this was his belief. And I said, well, where are you getting your news from? And he admitted that he didn't even listen to Fox much anymore, because they weren't really telling the truth. It was people up on YouTube. And to go to that point, how does the media, the game has been taken out of our hands, I'm in the media, to a large degree, because it is now the babble of voices, and not all the voices are friendly. So what is the role of media in that?
Yeah, it's hard. I think traditional media traditionally was regulated and self-regulating to a large extent. But now, as you say, there are so many different places where people get their news from, or get their media, get the things that help form their world perspective. And we can see at the moment with what's happening with Facebook, Google, Twitter, the challenge that governments are taking on trying to regulate those platforms. We see to a certain extent the responsibility or the actions that some of those platforms like Facebook and Twitter took during the course of the US election, as you've referenced, by actually marking tweets that they said were unsubstantiated or unreliable or were clearly misinformation. That's quite a big job, given the amount of content that goes across those platforms. And I was discussing this with my 23-year-old daughter, actually during the course of this week. She's recently completed a degree in public communications. She's just got a great job in the communication space. She gets her information from all sorts of different sources. And I was talking to her about the possibility of regulation and what she thought the answers might be. Did her generation have new ideas? And she just shook her head and said, God knows. So I'm not being very positive here. I actually think the media has a responsibility to society and to creating stability within society and to enriching democracy and to furthering the cause of democracy. And that means, giving people an equal voice, treating people with respect. In terms of celebration of diversity, I don't think that always means saying rah rah whoop whoop everything's wonderful, but it means we celebrate our diversity as something rich, the rich tapestry, if you like, of our country, or the deeply complex 25 million piece jigsaw that Australia is, with those 25 million different stories. And I think the media taking that responsibility is very important. But I also think, you were talking to Zany about education. I think education is crucial. What happens in primary schools, what happens in secondary schools, what happens at university level, like the sort of work that Brian has been doing at Griffith, is critical in terms of providing safe spaces for people to be able to challenge each other's views, but also to kind of ameliorate and moderate those views into something that's accepting of difference.
If on that subject there, if I can take it back to you, Uncle Ray, I went to the Black Lives Matter protests that took place in Sydney. It was at the time when it was controversial because the virus was starting to get its grip. But one of the things which really struck me was that in the numbers of people, and there were large numbers of people who walked through Sydney, was a large number of people who were of evidently Asian descent. And it struck me that there was a moment happening there, that there were people who were feeling solidarity with the notion of traditional and historic and current racism against Indigenous Australians who were of Asian background. I wonder, did you notice that? Were you aware of that? Do you have any comment on it?
Now, I'm listening to all the panelists here has been quite interesting. And one of the, I guess, the Black Lives Matter issue has brought a whole range of these kind of issues that have been sidelined for far too long back into or trying to bring it back into the center again and back into civil society so that we can actually explore the issues of race and racism and those kind of bigger issues that have not yet been resolved as a society or as a civil society, really. And I think for me, I'm not very optimistic about our future. I'm not very looking forward to, as you say, something that we can celebrate, because there's very little to celebrate. But if there was a value that I would like to see right back into our schools and right through our political systems and our institutions, would be hope. Hope for a better future. Some kind of reimagining of what we could become rather than what we have now. And I don't hear that hope yet, either from our leadership or even from I think the cry from the Black Lives Matter is we want a better hope for the future. And I think that's coming also from the other sides too, from the, from the elite society. They too want hope, but it depends on what we mean now by hope, because optimism really is unreality, it's delusional. And we're pretending against the evidence that everything is going to be fine. But what young people see, and what I see too, is discord, disharmony, dismay. Optimism doesn't seem to be credible anymore. And so what we really do need is a large dose of hope. And that must come from our civil institutions as well as our political institutions. And it must be, to me anyways, it should be instilled into our youth and to our children in the schools, because that's where I think that they're feeling it the most, is in our young people are feeling this incredible dismay. And our jails are full of our young people, so I know what it's like for them to feel dismayed, no hope for the future. And when they come out of those places, they're not going to get the kinds of benefits that others are enjoying because they've got a criminal record. So we just put them onto the side. And so hope for them would be something of an incredible importance to help them to see that, yes, this nation, the civil society that they're a part of, can offer them the dignity of work, for example. They can offer them another social contract where they can be a part of our community. But that takes humility to offer that kind of hope. And so that's what I'm thinking.
It's a somber take on it, certainly, but thank you for that, Uncle Ray. We've got a number of questions piling up, and I want to get to the questions, but just before I do, and just quickly, Zenny, were you surprised? Were you aware of the large crowds of Asian Australians taking part in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and does it speak to you of an experience that we perhaps don't reflect enough on?
Yeah, well, to me, that's not surprising, because the Asians and Asian countries come from a long history of turmoil and problems with race, segregation and discrimination in their own countries. So they come from that. They have experienced firsthand of that. I have experienced firsthand of that, and that's why I'm doing this now, because of what I have experience in the past. But I think it's also the cultural influences of respect for elders and respect for what is important. And as I mentioned before in one of our roundtables or one of our breakout sessions, when our Aboriginal elders are addressed as Uncle Ray and Uncle Cole and all that, and it's similar in the Philippines. We call total strangers, Filipinos, strangers to me, call me with always a title like a grandma or an auntie and all that, because they think we are all one big family. We are all related to each other. And I think there is that empathy for whatever the other person is going through, and a willingness to defend and support that person who they feel is being discriminated against.
Interesting insights. If I can go to questions now, I have one here from Joseph Fernandez, who says, social cohesion, while it is a laudable ideal, tends to collide with a range of other ideals. One, for example, is the freedom of expression, which can severely undermine social cohesion. How should we go about achieving the goal of balancing these two seemingly conflicting ideals? It is a great question. Stephen Pickard, any thoughts?
I don't know whether it's kind of like apples and oranges, that one. Social cohesion, what's the purpose of it? It's for a flourishing and healthy society. And what's a flourishing and healthy society look like? But one in which freedom of expression is respectfully entered into. So it's kind of like the search for a new civility rather than freedom of expression as such. I mean, that's always a contested area. But how do we do it in a civil way, in a respectful way? I think that's where that's what builds social cohesion and strength and flourishing. when we start to recover some of the traditions of virtues of listening and respect. So I don't see them pitted against each other so much as orientated to something much richer, which has to imbibe the great virtues that we usually aspire to in our best moments and struggle to in our not so good moments.
As a maven on Twitter, there's no doubt that it is extremes. It is people using extremely immoderate language against each other. Jane, do you have a view on that? Is there a way to build an ethic? I mean, some people contain it and call it simply good manners, but they're probably not the target audience. Is there a way to deal with free speech when that speech can be particularly unpleasant?
I wish I knew the answer. I mean, one way is, as many people do, is to block it. If you're the person who's the subject of the trolling or the attacks, but that doesn't really solve the problem. Interestingly, I noticed that one of the questions that's come in from somebody called Stephen Wilcox, who'd obviously picked up on what I was saying and said that the marking of posts during the US election apparently only reduced reposting by 9% on Facebook and 30% on Twitter. So 30% I think is actually reasonable. That's a fairly high success rate. One would hope that some of the reposting also noted that the content was dubious. Perhaps Facebook is more of an echo chamber than Twitter. I don't know, or perhaps Twitter is more open to loud, noisy fistfights. I wish I knew. I don't, Hugh. I mean, do you have any views?
Look, I think it's incredibly difficult. Freedom of speech is a good right. I think, people say the answer to nasty speech, to hate speech, is more speech, not less speech. And so I hear those arguments, but I think it's easy to make that argument when you're not on the receiving end of vile, racist language, and all you can do is to try to hold up as an example and espouse the value of moderate or considered speech, but you can't stop people saying really what they want, except there are some legal limits around it, but they themselves are contested. But Michael Day has put in a question which is somewhat on the same theme. Is there a positive way any of the panelists have found to discuss issues on which there is a significant disagreement? Brian Adams, this is what you do for a living. So is there a way?
Yes, clearly there is, because humans have existed somehow over hundreds of thousands of years. And by nature, we identify differences in others. We increase those differences to be very meaningful or part of our identities. And therefore, we've always existed with major differences. Now, there have been different approaches throughout history to address that, these, what some might see as incompatible differences. And I'd break them down into three categories, these strategies on how to deal with it. One would be domination, where we just try to say, no, my thoughts, my identity, my viewpoints, my religion, my political views, whatever, should win the day and take over, wipe out the other. Another one is avoidance, where, okay, that's what you believe, or that's what you think, or I'm going to take my people over here, or I'm going to take my Facebook page over here, right, and not listen to you anymore. Or there's collaboration. Now, for collaboration, this is broadly where I see these differences coming together to create something new. So it's not just coming together to discuss the differences, but it's actually with an emphasis of creating something that could not have existed without those two coming together. And so systems or initiatives that are purposely designed to bring these together should also have in focus an outcome. It may not already be predetermined, but the objective of having an outcome and finding ways to convince the various participants in that encounter to seek an outcome that they could not achieve on their own is an important part of the planning, the preparation for these. So I guess where I'm going with this is we can't just trust things to work out. We actually have to be purposeful about it. And purposeful means time and other resources put into it to make that possible, which then gets into another one of the questions that are posed, which was, do we have to always look at institutions and leaders? Can't we do more of a grassroots? Well, I think we have to, of course, have grassroots, and I'm fully on board with what Stephen was saying around civil society. But we also can't ignore the importance of the leadership, the institutions and structures, as well as the individual leadership that we have. But it has to be purposeful, and we have to have that as the goal that we want to achieve. And perhaps this is, again, a bit on the skeptical side or the negative side, but as things get more painful, as we've seen many times throughout history, even Australian history, that is in and of itself a motivator for us to finally shake loose of what has led us to that point and try to come up with something new and something different. So there's a bit of hope in the as things continue to roll forward in that way.
Did you want to jump in there, Ray?
I think one of the values that we have as Indigenous peoples is that we like to walk backwards into the future. We need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're going. And the moment we turn our back on history, we lose ourselves. We're lost. We're looking for another path. And I think this country here has an amnesia about its history and its where it's coming from. And we need to try to work together. But there's also another country that I think we sort of that I think has got a lot of this stuff right, and that's our little neighbours across the road here in Aotearoa. It's they seem to be able to gel together as a community and as a nation, and actually shown us some kind of way forward through their leadership, their institutions, as well as their grassroots people. And gee whiz, I'd like to move there tomorrow, but we've got work to do here. But walking backwards into the future, I think, is one of the things that helps us to know where we've come from in order to give us hope to where we should be going and the decisions that we make, because our forefathers made some very good decisions. We can't diss them and put them aside. Our ancestors got us to here. So why are we pushing them aside and trying to figure it out ourselves when they've already provided us with all the wisdom necessary to look at how we can live together and work together? That to me is hope.
It's interesting. I grew up in New Zealand. I wasn't born there, but I grew up there. And I was talking to an old school friend of mine just yesterday, and he was reflecting on Australia and saying, why are you guys always 20 years behind us on both gender issues, but also on way behind that on the issues of the First People there? And it's true. We've got a lot to learn, as you say. A question here from KC has come through. I'll summarize it really, but it's really the engagement of Australia's dominant elites. Where are they in this conversation? And if I can slightly reframe it, I guess, Stephen Pickard, and maybe put it to you, is that we have painfully seen in the not too recent past examples whereby political leaders of real power in this country have been quite willing to dog whistle, to put crowbars into the cracks that exist in our society and to try to lever them wider. How engaged do you think political leaders are to the notion of inclusion, particularly when it clashes with their perceived potential for a little bit of political advantage?
Wow. This is such a major and serious issue we have in our, modern Western societies, deeply pluralistic. Diversity is growing, and the fundamental driver seems to be the quest for power. And when that's driving things, the first victim of that is a vision of the whole. So you get the dog whistling, and you get the political positioning and the marketing of particular views, which is inherently conflictual and plays to particular interest groups. But underlying it is the deep desire and greed for power over, which is back to I was resonating with what Brian said about the different ways in which you go about conversation. One is domination, which is no conversation at all. So unless our political leaders are role models for the kind of society we hope for, then it really is debilitating. And actually, it's very discouraging for a whole range of other civil society groups and other institutions. So, I mean, other members of the panel have views about this, but I think it's a very serious matter when the questions of the fundamental, I mentioned it before, virtues and character, and are so fundamental to the kind of leaders that we need in transitional times. But it's the road less travelled, and we need to get back on it again.
Thank you, Stephen. I've got a question here from an anonymous attendee, but it goes to something I think many people were at home watching the US election, and where they have those brilliantly clever people with their interactive maps, and they're showing where the votes are coming in, and they have tended to reveal something. One is that the Democrat votes in the US context were in the major capital cities. And outside those major capital cities, there was an enormous sweeps of just red areas, as they were called them, the Trump areas. And I feel as if we have something similar here in Australia. And the question goes to this. We have a geographically vast and wide country with populations dotted in many and remote places. How do we bridge the gap between the rural and urban divide that exists? Because in my sense of driving around the country, it really does exist. You live, I think, in outside a capital city, or are you in Canberra there, Stephen?
I'm in Canberra. Yeah.
There's a lot of bush around there. I mean, one of the things I notice, I take my kids around as part of their growing up in a big four-wheel drive. We drive out for miles out, but partly to try to give them a sense of all of that. Do you sense that there is among the divisions is one between city and town, and we don't talk enough about it?
Yeah, I think there is. It pulsates there, but it's fueled by interest groups. I mean, it was said many years ago, Australia lives on the sheep's back, but I mean, we need each other, and it might not be the same these days. I think rural Australia is really suffering right now, and has been for a long time. The strange development that's happened over this period of coronavirus has been the movement into regional and rural Australia from the cities. How interesting a development that is, the repopulating because of perceived difficulties and problems within the city. So it's really unclear how this is all going to unfold, but I'd love to see a much closer resonance between city and country, but I'm sure Ray's got some views about this, and I'd love to hear them.
Well, let's hear from him, Ray. You need to unmute.
Very good question. Thank you, Stephen. I was just reflecting on a whole range of things. I think we have a one of the constitutions that I read that I really enjoyed reading was the one from Switzerland, because I wanted to know how that country could remain neutral in all those wars and yet still come out of that with such incredible richness. And as I was reflecting on that, I was looking at our own constitution, and even in our constitution, we still have these incredibly powerful articles there in 25 and 51 that still define race. And I think we don't talk about this enough, to actually go back to the very fundamentals of the drivers of our society, of our nation, and examine that and say, what do we need to do to change this particular document that reflects the types of country, or reimagine the type of country we want to live in, that drives these kinds of issues that we're looking at here. So that's my response. It's a bigger response than just talking about rural and urban divide, even though I think the COVID thing has moved or shifted that particular discussion in that particular in that direction, because people can now work from anywhere in the country, in the rural areas, which raises those other issues of what happens to the CBD and all of those other kind of challenges, which we're not even discussing either. So yeah, it's this particular pandemic has given us a wonderful opportunity, I think, to re-examine ourselves as to where we are as a nation and re-examine our fundamentals, including our constitution, and start to reimagine what we should become. And I'll point across the waves again and say, look at what New Zealand has accomplished. And the only reasons why Maori are involved is because they got a treaty. We are so far down the track of we're not even on that path.
True enough. And you mentioned Switzerland as well. If you look at that 700 years of peace or whatever it is in Switzerland, and they've got a small country with 3 completely different languages that run. People don't even speak the same language, and it still seems to manage to hold together. If I can bring you back in again, Ida Walker, one of the questions here Safali Williams has put to us is, how do we have conversations, as she puts it, with the less eloquent? Any thoughts on how we ensure everyone with a diverse voice, even those who are marginalized or who are often not so eloquent, how do they get heard? How do we move this, I guess, away from an elite conversation into one that everyone, even those who feel marginalized in voice, are actually at the center of the conversation? Ida, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it comes back to a lot of what it's already been shared, like really having these convictions that everyone has something to contribute, irrespective of the background that they come from, this elite group of people, or those perhaps who are not as eloquent, but I think really are eloquent in their thoughts and what their hopes and aspirations are. And it's really giving that space to allow many voices to come together. And a lot of it is based on the conviction that every group, every people, every age, no matter what our experience is, has something unique to offer to the progress of society, and to value that. And I think that that's also part of the conviction that we're all contributing to that progress, that flourishing society that we hope and envision. So if we are bringing those people together in a space which is conciliatory, respectful, then those perhaps who may not usually speak have the floor, have the opportunity to make their contribution. And I think we found this in the inclusive narrative roundtables that we held. And I just wanted to offer that hope to everyone, that civil society is really yearning for these spaces, and also has the capacity to create that opportunity for people, rural, urban, Indigenous, migrant, every single person to come together and speak to, something that we want to learn or create in our country, a society which is harmonious, which is looking at the involvement of everyone and celebrating the fact that we are so diverse. But unless we're willing to create that opportunity, and even create spaces that are culturally appropriate, we will continue to marginalize those voices that we don't usually hear from. And it's the active seeking of voices, I think, that is really important. And to know that, for them to know that what they have to offer will actually be taken seriously and it goes somewhere. It's not just a tokenistic involvement as well. And, it's something that we've tried to learn about. It's an attempt. And I think that we, although that we've spoken that there are many negative influences, I think it's just offering that, let's give this a try. Let's all give it a go and see what happens. And then we can decide whether it works or not.
Excellent thoughts. And it chimes with a question from Sabai Sinai saying, how do we empower youth in all of this? The question is, how do we make sure that youth who have made themselves known on things like the Black Lives Matter marches, as she points us out, and particularly the school climate change protests, how do we make sure that they feel that their efforts and their voice will not be quashed by the system to maintain the status quo? I'll leave you with the last words, any with your interest in education. These are contested spaces that they're arguing political issues, I suppose, particularly when it comes to things like climate change. But how do young people, I suppose, get to understand their place in it, both their power in it, but also the limitations on their voice?
Thanks to you. I think they should not be afraid and they shouldn't be stymied. Our leaders should stand on a set of values and beliefs because ultimately they will be judged by them. And whatever they say, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, it has a life. It has a life. And once you've said that, you can't erase it. So I think the youth need to be empowered. I mean, I keep saying this, whether they're in a primary, we should listen to them, secondary, the Greta Thunbergs. I mean, what's happened to her? She's become very quiet because she was maligned by everybody and really put down by people who were laughing at her, and some people called her crazy and all this. And it's not, she has something to say, and good on her for being so courageous and saying it. But we should give others a chance to say the same thing. Can I just mention about the eloquence and the people who are not as articulate in voicing their opinions? There are other ways, through song and dance and through their art and through their food, that they can engage with their multiculturalism and with their own culture and all of that, rather than speaking out. Show it in other ways and means by doing through their culture and traditions and their art and song and dance and even the food. Food is a very unifying factor.
Food is indeed a unifying factor, and I'm conscious that we're approaching lunchtime. So on that splendid note, we're out of time. We've had many people put in their questions. In fact, it's been extremely lively there. I apologize to those we didn't get to. I think some of those questions were similar to others, and so many of the answers hopefully responded to some of the questions that were being put to us. But thanks to everyone who put in those questions and everyone who participated. I'd like to thank all our panelists, but I think my duty now is to hand back over to Venus.
Well, what a lively and rich discussion that was. Thank you to each of you for your thoughtful contributions, and thank you for Hugh for navigating such a complex topic and really helping to elicit such fruitful insights about the type of future that we want to shape together. I really appreciated the dimension of the conversation that spoke to some of those shared values, particularly in terms of overcoming fragmentation, but also what Uncle Ray mentioned about this yearning for unity in our country and this great ideal for hope. And I think that this yearning and this hopefulness is really captured quite beautifully in the Creating an Inclusive Narrative publication. And some of these contributions that were offered about the role of youth, about looking at our shared history, about listening to one another and really fostering greater degrees of that capacity to listen is something that can definitely help us to shape the way forward and to see each other as all having a role to play, and that irrespective of whether we are based in a community group or are a politician or part of a social institution, we're all protagonists in this process towards high degrees of social cohesion. And with that in mind, I was moved to share actually two quotes from this publication because they really spoke quite strongly to some of those questions and themes. On page 10 of this publication, and these are quotes from participants themselves, someone from the Northern Territory has says, "It's about seeing our own differences as complementary to each other, and we start being more accepting to the complementary nature of each other rather than conflicting. When we are a socially cohesive society, our engagements are more about transformation. I transform their environment with them, our engagement with them, and it transforms me when I engage with them. When we are not in a socially cohesive society, our engagements are purely transactional, and there is no deeper level in which we engage with each other. So we want to be able to go from being transactional to transformational." And there was another quote here that spoke quite strongly to what Uncle Ray had mentioned, and I just want to conclude with sharing this. This is found on page 21, and it's from a participant who was based in New South Wales. The older I get, the more media I follow and read, the more I'm convinced that Australia's relationship with its own Indigenous people is the key to how we deal with otherness. Where we progress and go backwards on that affects pretty much everything we do. Well, obviously, this session now means that our conference has come to a close. This has been an incredible space to reflect together, to strengthen our resolve as members of a growing community, and to engage in learning from one another as we work towards identifying the methods and approaches in attaining high degrees of social cohesion and harmony for our country. I'd like to now invite my colleague Ida Walker to offer some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Venus. And again, thank you to every panelist and speaker that has been part of the conference, and also those who have been part of the roundtables who have contributed to the Inclusive Narrative publication. I just wanted to finish the conference off by saying that a big thank you to our text team, and actually naming them because of how much that they've put into all of the preparation and during the conference, and that's Parviz Dima and Shirin Rahanian, and also the team that has worked behind the scenes in pulling this conference together and giving so many hours of their time and sleepless nights as well in pulling the Inclusive Narrative publication together as well. We can't really extend adequately the gratitude that we feel to all of those dear people that have given so much of themselves to bring all of you together to benefit from the insights and the experiences, the stories, the thoughts and ideas that have been shared by our panelists and our speakers this week. And it's been such a joy to be able to learn how to do this online and to be able to reach those who couldn't actually physically come to a space. And I think that the pandemic has allowed us to learn about this new way of connecting, to bridge any physical divides, but also to allow many to access the knowledge and the wisdoms that have been shared this week. So I, again, thank you deeply from the bottom of our hearts, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you through the publication, creating spaces to have these conversations a bit more deeper, but also invite you to continue and create your own opportunities to explore the values, the insights, the ideas, the ways of practically moving forward with one another. So I wish you a good day, and we look forward to connecting soon. Thank you.